everybody, I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna ơi! When most people think of the Vietnam War, they think of a war between Vietnam and the USA, but that's only part of the history. In reality, the war involved a complex web of nations, not just Vietnam and the USA. A few socialist nations like China and the Soviet Union supported Vietnam indirectly, providing weapons and supplies. Former colonies of France like Laos and Cambodia fought alongside Vietnam to defend our homeland. On the other side, numerous nations allied with the USA, and some of these imperialist nations even helped commit horrible atrocities against civilians, not just in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. These illegal war crimes remain a dark and often overlooked chapter of the war. In this series, we will explore the lesser-known stories of nations that participate in the genocidal occupation of my country, Vietnam. In this first episode, we will look at the participation of Australia, a close ally of the US, which has been described by some as a military vassal state to the USA. We will try to explain why Australia joined the war, how it came to support a US-backed fascist regime in the south of Vietnam, and we will shed light on war crimes committed by the Australian military. This is the true story of Australia's war against Vietnam. Our story begins in the late 1950s. The south of Vietnam was under the control of Ngo Dinh Diep, an unelected fascist dictator whose regime was propped up by the United States. As American President Lyndon B. Johnson geared up for war against the north of Vietnam, he rallied allies to join the fight against communism. Around the globe, American diplomats spread warnings about what they called the domino theory, a concept that would shape decades of foreign policy and lead to terrible devastation in Southeast Asia. The domino theory was a cornerstone of Cold War ideology, pushed by American strategists from 1950s all the way through the 1980s. It argued that if one country gave way to communism, its neighbors would follow in quick succession, toppling like a row of dominoes. This idea became a rallying cry for interventionist policies, driving the US and its allies to take drastic measures to contain communism. Today, the domino theory has been thoroughly debunked. Let's file it under things reactionaries say that would be awesome if true. But back in the 1960s, it was an extremely powerful propaganda tool. The US wielded it to instill fear in Western capitalists and the governments they influenced, justifying military interventions and alliance in the name of stopping communism's spread. Initially, Australia's government hesitated to commit to direct involvement in the war in Vietnam. The United States wanted Australia to fully participate in the preparation for the war, but Australia dragged its feet and only offered minimal support early on, sending only 30 military consultants and engineers to the south of Vietnam in 1962. The United States continuously urged the Australian government to offer more support, and after 2 years in 1964, Australia agreed to increase their involvement in the preparation for an aggressionary war by sending 6 Caribou aircraft and 74 soldiers to help directly with the illegal occupation of Vietnam. In 1965, the United States of America began its war against Vietnam by fabricating the Gulf of Tonkin incident. United States diplomats wasted no time pressuring Australia to send more troops and military supplies to help conquer the north of Vietnam. Australia capitulated, and by the end of 1965, there were about 4,500 Australian troops directly involved in the Vietnam War, along with a huge supplies of Australian airplanes, helicopters, guns, and supplies. Participation in the war was unpopular right from the beginning in Australia. Many Australian civilians were quick to protest and resist the participation of the Australian military in Vietnam, especially once fighting broke out. Australian elections were held in 1966, and many Australian politicians were afraid of backlash due to this rising tide of anti-war sentiment in public opinion. So it was decided to temporarily halt the delivery of Australian troops to Vietnam for a few months. Unfortunately, this pause was little more than a political maneuver, a cynical attempt to placate the Australian public. And the moratorium on involvement in combat with Vietnam only lasted just long enough for Australian politicians to stay in office. Shortly after the elections ended, in November of 1966, Australia immediately resumed its involvement in the Vietnam War. From 1966 to 1972, Australia ramped up its support for the war, sending a steady stream of troops and military equipment to the south of Vietnam. This included the assignment of the HMAS Hobart, an air warfare destroyer of the Royal Australian Navy, an entire squadron of B-52 Canberra aircraft, 56 Centurion tanks, and 1,000 tons of bombs, along with tens of thousands of Australian troops sent to fight in Vietnam. So, why did Australia commit to such an unpopular and controversial war in Vietnam? Despite widespread public opposition, the government pressed on. But why? Vietnamese historians have identified three key reasons behind Australia's involvement, reasons that reveal the complex motivations in driving this decision. First, it's important to note that until 1945, Australia was a British colony, meaning its participation in World War I and World War II was dictated by the UK. However, after gaining full sovereignty, Australia had to make its own decisions about international conflicts. Joining the US in Vietnam was one of the first major tests of its independent foreign policy, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. In 1954, France faced a crushing defeat in the Indochina War, marking the end of its colonial ambitions in Vietnam. Around the same time, England also lost its most important Asian colony, Singapore. For Australia, a Western-dominated nation, this was a turning point. It had always relied on the UK and, to a lesser extent, France as strong important allies to protect its interests in Asia. Australia now began searching for a new patient to ensure its security and influence in the Asia-Pacific region. The final push for Australia came with the Suez Crisis in 1956. This was a complicated international event, but to try to put it simply, Egypt sought to nationalize the Suez Canal, a vital waterway linking Europe and Africa, which was still under British and French control. In a desperate bid to reclaim their fading colonial glory, England and France, with Israel's support, launched an attack on Egypt to retake the canal. This move sparked fierce opposition from both the US and the Soviet Union, a rare moment of Cold War unity. Both superpowers condemned the invasion, marking a significant shift in the global power dynamics. The US threatened to impose sanctions on Israel if it continued supporting England and France. Meanwhile, the USSR issued an even more dire warning. The Soviet Union threatened to launch nuclear missiles against England, France, and Israel if they didn't withdraw from Egypt. To make matters worse for France and England, the Suez Crisis ignited massive anti-war protests in England, France, and Israel, as citizens of all three nations rallied against the conflict. By March of 1957, under immense global pressure, England, France, and Israel had no choice but to withdraw all their troops from Egypt, marking the end of their ill-fated campaign. The fight in the Suez Canal was a political disaster for the Triple Alliance of England, France, and Israel. Far from restoring their power and influence, it left them weaker than ever. The once mighty British and French empires were no longer seen as global superpowers. All three nations now faced the daunting reality of a war dominated by the rising influence of the United States and the Soviet Union. Throughout this whole dramatic affair, Australia was watching. Seeing the power of England and France crumble served as a wake-up call for the Australian government. Faced with a choice between aligning with the United States, a rising imperialist force, or the Soviet Union, the leader of the new communist bloc, Australia made its decision. It turned its back on its former colonial masters and decided to develop a close alliance with the USA, a move that would shape its foreign policy right up until today. Australia shared the USA's fabricated fear of the domino theory, the belief that communism would sweep across Asia, threatening the so-called free world of colonial and imperial powers. Australia was particularly concerned since it was so close to Asia, and the capitalists who control Australia feared that communism might spread from Asia to Australia. This fear drove Australia to take a hardline stance against communism in the region. I translated this book. I worked on this for 3 years. This book is on the Vietnamese curriculum of Marxism-Leninism. And this is part 1, dialectical materialism. Part 2, historical materialism, will be out very soon. You can get the ebook for free at banyanhouse.org, or you can order a hard copy to support us. Now back to the video. And so Australia, despite having a history of being colonially oppressed itself, now decided to walk the imperialist path to become just another bully of other nations. The first target for Australia's newly found aggression against communism was Korea. From 1950 to 1953, Australian troops fought alongside the US in the Korean War. Then, from 1956 to 1960, they joined British forces in Malaysia to combat communist insurgents. These conflicts set the stage for Australia's deeper involvement in Vietnam. Continuing this pattern, Australia committed troops to the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1972, siding with the US in its illegal war of aggression against Vietnamese communist forces. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Australia's alliance with the USA was driven by economic interests. In my last video, I explained how the USA became a superpower in the aftermath of World War II. Thanks to this new economic supremacy, the USA quickly began attracting nations around the world that were eager to align with its economic might. According to the US State Department, the United States is Australia's largest source of foreign direct investment. And to this day, the US still stands as a top investor in Australia, committing $65 billion in the year 2024 alone. So there's a clear financial incentive for Australia to remain a loyal ally of the USA. And this was as true in the 1950s and 60s as it is today. But this economic benefit came at a moral cost. Over the decades, Australia sent hundreds of thousands of troops to fight alongside the US in conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the War on Terror. Wars often marked by atrocities against innocent civilians, including killings, torture, and mass rape. During its decade-long involvement in Vietnam, from 1962 to 1972, Australia deployed 60,000 troops, many of whom committed horrific atrocities against Vietnamese civilians. These actions remain a dark chapter in Australia's military history. One of the most infamous clashes between Australian troops and Vietnamese revolutionary fighters was the Battle of Long Ton. On August 18th and 19th, 1966, a force of 108 Australian troops, supported by armored vehicles, helicopters, and heavy artillery, engaged in a brutal confrontation. By the end of the battle, 245 Vietnamese communists had been killed and over 300 were injured. For over 50 years, the Battle of Long Ton has been celebrated in the West as a heroic triumph of Australian troops over the so-called evil Viet Cong. This narrative, however, glosses over the darker realities of the conflict. In 2016, Don Tate, an Australian Vietnam veteran, former history teacher, and an author, exposed the atrocities committed by Australian troops during the battle. Among these was the execution of wounded Vietnamese prisoners of war the day after the battle, a clear war crime. Survivors of the battle reported that up to 17 Vietnamese soldiers were executed by Australian troops. These acts, by any measure, constitute war crimes. One of the soldiers involved, Bob Buick, openly admitted to these crimes in his autobiography, Old Guts, No Glory. He confessed to killing a wounded Vietnamese soldier, justifying it as putting the man out of his misery, despite having no medical training. In 2000, James Ferguson Thompson, a barrister and former legal officer during the Vietnam War, wrote a scathing letter to the Weekend Australian. He expressed his disgust at Buick's admission of killing a wounded soldier, and Thompson stated that if he had been aware of Buick's actions at the time, he would have had Buick court-martialed for murder. Despite this, no charges were ever brought against Buick. Astonishingly, he was even awarded the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, for which he was never even qualified. Australian troops were also implicated in the torturing of Vietnamese civilians, another grave violation of international law. One of the most notorious methods used by Australian war criminals was waterboarding, a brutal practice designed to extract information through suffering. In 2010, a shocking revelation came to light. An Australian soldier confessed that he and two officer-rank interrogators had deceived senior military and government officials about the torture of a young Vietnamese woman. This admission exposed a deliberate cover-up at the highest level. Peter Barham, a former SAS surgeon, has broken his silence to reveal he was in the Nui Dat army tent in October 1966, when the young Vietnamese woman was tortured. According to his own words, on October 25, 1966, 2 months after the Long Ton battle, a woman was captured by a platoon led by Second Lieutenant John O'Halloran. She spent the night tied to O'Halloran, who told her she would be shot if his men were attacked by Vietnamese forces. On the next day, she was delivered to Nui Dat, where their base was located. Dragged to the interrogation tent, she started to scream when her gag and blindfold were removed. Australian warrant officer Ken Borland shouted and banged his fist when she refused to speak, then threatened her with waterboarding. These two soldier cowboys bowed her wrists behind her back, placed a wet towel across her face, and as she breathed in, the towel went in and they poured water down her. They were not that good at it, but it went on for at least half an hour and I felt sick but couldn't leave the tent because I was the interpreter and had to relay what she said during her torture. She was distressed, and this was after the soldiers asked me to tell her in Vietnamese that they would pull her nails out, stick objects up her orifices, and do to her just about anything else very painful that you could imagine. But when the Australian government launched the inquiry to the waterboarding torture case, we had to lie and it was swept under the carpet. I've lived with that lie for 44 years, but no more because it played a great part in wrecking my life. Of course, no one was brought into martial court. No justice was ever served. The atrocity faded into obscurity, ignored by Western media and human rights organizations alike. In 2014, Lieutenant Ben Morris, an Australian platoon officer who fought in the Vietnam War, came forward with a shocking admission. He had been involved in the massacre of Vietnamese civilians at Nui Dat Base. According to Morris, on October 23, 1967, a group of Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children, were foraging for bamboo shoots when they accidentally stumbled into an ambush zone. Australian troops opened fire, killing 5 and wounding 6 innocent civilians. Morris revealed that the company commander, Major Peter White, who would later become defense minister under John Howard, proposed a chilling plan to plant capture enemy weapons on the civilians' bodies, disguising them as Vietnamese communist fighters. Morris added that he later discovered that this horrific tactic, placing enemy weapons on civilian corpses, was disturbingly common. Major White wanted to inflate the company's success rate by falsifying the body counts for enemy combatants. As you can see, Australian troops were no saviors of the Vietnamese people. They were criminal invaders, just like the American counterparts. They claimed to care for us, to save us from ourselves, but in reality, they brought only violence and suffering. They murdered, tortured, and lied about their atrocities, deceiving the world while innocent lives were destroyed. Even to this day, justice remains unserved. The Australian government has never acknowledged the actions of its military in Vietnam. No apologies, no reparations, no accountability. The truth about these atrocities is still hidden from the Australian public, buried under layers of denial and silence. Yet, there is hope. Across the globe, countless people have seen through the imperialist lies, and this began with the fight to end the war. During the 60s and early 70s, a powerful anti-war movement swept the world, including Australia. While Australian troops were inflicting violence on Vietnamese people, brave Australians at home risked their lives to protest the war. Year after year, as more Australian troops were sent to Vietnam, the resistance at home grew stronger. In 1969, a staggering 1.5 million Australians signed a petition calling for the withdrawal of all troops from Vietnam, a powerful testament to the people's opposition to the war. Then, in May 1970, around 100,000 people participated in a massive anti-war sit-in protest in the streets of Melbourne, led by Jim Carnes. This historic demonstration became the largest protest in Australian history until it was surpassed by the anti-Iraq war protests in 2003. These protests, combined with global anti-war movements as well as the undeniable victories that Vietnamese communists had against the imperialist USA, played a pivotal role in pressuring the Australian government. In January 1973, the decision was finally made to withdraw all Australian troops from Vietnam. 2 years later, on April 30, 1975, the Vietnam War finally came to an end. On that day, at 11:30 a.m., the National Liberation Front of Vietnam launched a decisive attack on Saigon, completely liberating the South from the US-backed fascist puppet regime of Dương Văn Minh. After decades of relentless struggle, Vietnam forced the US to sign the Paris Peace Accord in 1973, effectively ending the war. Under this agreement, the US and its allies, including Australia, were required to withdraw all troops from Vietnam. In total, from the arrival of the first Australian military advisor in 1962 to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, nearly 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam, including ground troops, Air Force, and Navy personnel. Of these, 521 lost their lives and over 3,000 were wounded. The victory of the Vietnamese people against an alliance of the world's richest and most powerful countries, including the USA and Australia, holds profound significance in the history of humanity. Vietnam proved to the world that we stood on the right side of history, that our unyielding desire for independence and freedom could overcome even the greatest military might. Sadly, neither Australia nor the US seem to have learned from their mistakes in Vietnam. Australia continues to send troops to every US-led war, from Iraq to the so-called War on Terror in West Asia. While sending their own citizens to die abroad, Australia grows richer and more dependent on the US. It seems this is a price the wealthy capitalists in Australia are willing to pay. I hope the true intentions of the Australian state behind its participation in imperialist war are now clear. They have consistently sided with the fascist state of the USA. In Vietnam, they have to support the fascist puppet government that terrorized my people for decades. In my last video, I explained that the people of Europe are standing at a crossroads right now. And today I would like to deliver the same message to the people of Australia. You are also at the crossroads right this moment. In the last few months, the US had unmasked itself, removing any remaining doubt about its fascist inclination. The US is quick to abandon allies for profits, and this has always been the case. Now the choice is yours. Will you remain a lapdog of US imperialism? Will you continue to prop up the AUKUS alliance that only serves the imperialist interests of the USA? Will you risk being betrayed by the US at any moment? Or will you choose the true independence, freedom, and self-determination, forging friendship with the rest of the world? As I said before, true friendship is possible. And again, speaking as a Vietnamese woman, if you ever seek to exploit us again, you will regret it. We have proven time and time again that we are not afraid to stand up, to fight, and to win against invaders, just as we did before against both you and your master. But I would much prefer to be friends. I hope Australia will choose the right path and join the right side of history. So that's the story of Australia's war against Vietnam. In future videos, I will uncover the hidden history of other countries that were involved in the Vietnam War, including adversaries like New Zealand, South Korea, Thailand, and Israel, as well as allies like the USSR, China, and Laos. Stay tuned for these revelations. Thank you for watching and see you next time.